Is there any entity in reality that has aseity as an intrinsic property?
I would say no, because it's categorized as an extrinsic property. Essential properties are things that God must have in order to be what he is. An intrinsic property is just something you have in virtue of yourself. So God has his extrinsic properties like aseity, essentially, but it's an essential extrinsic property. You can have essential extrinsic properties, essential relational properties, and you can have essential intrinsic properties. So things like omnipotence and omniscience and perfect goodness are essential intrinsic properties, and aseity is an essential extrinsic property.
An essential property exists in a being because of its essence. Is that correct? That's why we
Yes.
call it essential.
Yes. Yeah.
So aseity as an essential property of capital G God exists due to God's essence, correct?
Yes.
Aseity is a property of God because of God's essence. God's essence, by definition, cannot be grounded by something else, right?
Yes, that's true.
So God's aseity cannot be due to anything other than God's essence.
A very important thesis within metaphysics is origin essentialism, the idea that we basically have our parents essentially. And so my property of being the son of my father is an essential property that I have, but that's an extrinsic property. So even though I have the extrinsic property of being the son of my dad, I have it in virtue of standing in a relation of generation to my dad, it's essential to me. I have it, and it makes me what I am. So what you have to understand is that's the same thing with the extrinsic property of aseity. God has it in the sense that it makes it what the real definition of me, part of my essence, is being the son of my dad. Even though that's extrinsic, it is something I have that's essential to me. Now, the same thing with God. God has the aseity property being uncaused or ungrounded. That's something which makes him what he is, okay, is part of his essence. But again, it's an extrinsic property because he possesses it because his lack of standing in a grounding relation to other things. And it can be other possible things as well. So because he lacks that grounding relation to other things, there is no grounding relation between him and any other possible thing that could exist, he then is ase. But he has that essentially. So that's why you need to understand that you can have extrinsic properties that are essential, but it doesn't make it non-essential because it's extrinsic.
The example you use where my essence is essential to me, right? But it's extrinsic. That's because my parents in this case cause me. So in a sense, my parents are constitutive of my essence. We can't apply that to God, right? There is nothing that's causing God to exist. So I feel like that analogy just doesn't apply. And then when you repeated your formula again, you said, look, God has aseity because God is not grounded by anything else. Okay, that's true as a descriptive thing. God is ase because nothing grounds God. The deeper question is, why is it the case that nothing grounds God? Is it because nothing out there like chose to generate God, or is it because of the very nature or essence of God that God just cannot be grounded? And I'm saying it's the second one. Even if for this argument's sake, aseity was defined as extrinsic to God, there has to be something intrinsic to God to explain why God is ase, to explain why God isn't grounded by anything.
Why must there be something intrinsic to God to ground that extrinsic property?
Okay, so an extrinsic property, when it's possessed by a particular entity, right? There has to, if it's extrinsic to it, right? Extrinsic means it comes from outside of it.
Oh, no. It doesn't mean it comes. It just means that it's an outward-looking property.
It's due to if something is extrinsic, it's extrinsic due to something external to the entity. That's why you're labeling it extrinsic. So I'm asking for an explanation There's an explanation of why me being the son of Mr. and Mrs. Andani, there's an explanation why that is essential and extrinsic to me. The explanation is Mr. and Mrs. Andani. For God, we can't make an appeal to something outside of God to explain why God has aseity. We can only appeal to God's own nature to explain why he has aseity. And if you do appeal to something outside of God and you say, look, all these other entities, they just happened not to generate this God. If you do appeal, then God exists and God is ase due to another, which would make God a contingent being in and of himself. A contingent God, or you have a God who is intrinsically ase. I don't really see the third option.
I think there's a mistake here. So there's dependence relations in property possession, and there's dependence relation relative to the existence of an entity. So what I was trying to say to you is that you can possess a property that's dependent upon something else, but you still exist irrespective of that other thing. For example, the property of being the creator and sustainer of all reality. That's a property that's dependent upon other things existing. So it's extrinsic, but God exists as the creator of all reality in virtue of himself. He has it because he's omnipotent. He creates everything that he wants. But the property that he possesses, he has it dependent upon other things. I'll give you another example. If you assume Trinitarianism, for example, you'll have God having the property of being loved by the Son. Now, that is an essential property because there is no time when the Father is not loved by the Son. There is no possible world where the Father is not loved by the Son. That will be an essential property of him, but it will also be an extrinsic property of him. It'll be a property that he has, and he is dependent upon the Son loving him, but it can never be the case that he doesn't love him. God has this necessarily, but it's something that he could only have in virtue of something else. Or the property of not being hated by the Son. That's a property that God possesses, and he possesses it essentially, because there can never be any possible world where he's hated by the Son. But it's an extrinsic property. It doesn't stand in a relation of hate to the Son. He doesn't stand in that property. It's extrinsic. But it's also essential to him because there is no world in which God exists where he's hated by the Son. There's no possible world. And so it's the same thing with aseity. Aseity is a property that God has by him not standing in a relation to anything that grounds him. And it can never be the case that there's anything that grounds him. So it's essential to him, but it's still extrinsic. What I really believe is sort of flaming the fires of your objection is this problem between essential properties and extrinsic and intrinsic, and there's a distinction there, and also the problem between dependence of properties and depending for your existence upon something. You can depend upon properties for something, but also not depend upon your existence, such as, again, depending on the property being loved by the Son. The Father's property of being loved by the Son is dependent upon the Son loving him, but his existence is not dependent upon the Son. So the same thing with aseity. Aseity is a property of not being grounded by anything. That property is dependent upon other things not grounding him, but his existence is not dependent upon anything. So essential properties can be had, but they can be had in an extrinsic fashion in a way that doesn't seem to have a problem with essential properties or essential possession.
I would say this, the property of being loved by the Son and the existence of the Father, okay, the property being loved by the Son is a property that is superadded to the existence of the Father. And it's a property that could be decoupled from the existence of the Father, okay? Just logically speaking. So you have the Father's existence plus the property of being loved by the Son, being hated by somebody else, by Satan, or whatever it is. So here, the existence and the property is superadded to the existence. This, in my humble opinion, is not adequate to talk about the relationship between aseity and the existence of the Father, because aseity is not a property that is superadded to the existence of the Father. Rather, aseity is a description of the mode of the existence of the Father. The Father's existence is an existence which is entirely ungrounded. That's why we call it ase. Ase meaning not meaning not from, not from something else. Whereas the existence of the Son, the existence of the Spirit, those are grounded. So aseity is not just something you can super add to the Father's existence. Aseity rather is a description of the motive existence of the Father. So therefore, what I'm saying is, if we want to say that the Father's aseity is dependent or extrinsic meaning it would be a property that's dependent on something else. If we want to say that about his aseity, it would follow then that since the aseity of the Father describes his existence, then the Father's existence would undoubtedly end up being dependent on whatever it is you make the Father's aseity dependent on.
I would say I disagree with you again, as you'll assume. The first reason why I disagree with you is because, just going with the example that I gave, I do believe it's apt. The reason why is because it isn't something that can be decoupled from the existence of the Father. How you know that is because there is no logically possible world where there is a case where the Son doesn't love the Father. So every logically possible world will be one in which the Father is loved by the Son. So you will never find a world where, logically speaking, you can decouple it. So I would say that you also need to realize that fundamentality, so similar to aseity, same thing, being ungrounded, is a superadded property, because the existence of the Father is had by him because of his omnipotence. Similar to Swinburne, I believe that all the divine properties flow from omnipotence in a way. Why God exists is because he's omnipotent. And so there's no way that he could not exist, given his omnipotence. And that's same with the Son and the Spirit. But then the way that God exists is by an underived form of omnipotence. So that underivedness, that fundamentality, that independence is a superadded property. You have his omnipotence, which grounds his existence. And then you have, well, how does he exist? Well, he exists fundamentally. Okay, and that is a superadded property. It's an additional property to his omnipotence. And so the only way your argument works is if you already assume your position that you have to put aseity within the within the intrinsic properties of God. Omnipotence and all the other properties are the things that make God exist. And then you have aseity, which is an extrinsic property that doesn't make God exist as such. It just individuates him. We can pick out this divine person because he is the uncaused one. And the way we pick out the Son and the Spirit is because they are the derived ones. And so they're just individuating properties, but they're not the things which actually make God what he is as such, in the sense of his intrinsic great-making properties, his omnipotence, his omniscience, and things like that. So I do believe it is superadded, and superadded because it functions as an individuating factor of God. So I feel that your position only works if you already assume that it is something which is already part of the intrinsic properties of God.